From the News Channel 5 Network, this is OpenLine.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to OpenLine and our first show of the new year, our first show of 2022. And this year, this show, we are going to look back on 2021 and a list of what is considered to be wasteful spending by the Beacon Center. They put out this report every year. It's called the Pork Report. We've had them on many years in a row to talk about this, and it's always interesting. It always generates some thoughtful discussion, and it generates some thought about where are we putting our money. And so, always happy to have with us Mark Cunningham. He is the Vice President of Strategy and Communications with the Beacon Center of Tennessee, and he's joining us via Zoom from far away. So, Mike, thank you for coming on, Mark.
Yep, no problem. I'm excited to start the year off right. I appreciate being invited on.
So, all right, you've been on before, but the Beacon Center, essentially tell us quickly, what is the Beacon Center?
Sure. So we're a free market think tank. We're based out of Nashville, but we are a statewide think tank. And what that means is that we come up with like policy solutions. We work, we have a lobbying arm, but we also try to educate the public, which is kind of the point of the Pork Report. And a lot of people don't necessarily know what free market is, but essentially we're right, or we're consistent when the political parties aren't. So we agree with the Democrats sometimes, we agree with the Republicans sometimes, because we are the ones being consistent, and it's our job to hold both parties' feet to the fire.
There are times where you've worked with the ACLU, and there are times, obviously, where you have not. But so there you are bipartisan to some extent, and we can talk more about
Absolutely.
that later if people want to. But that gives some sense of where this is coming from. And now, what is the Pork Report? What is that?
So the Pork Report is our annual report. It's actually the 16th straight year we've done this, but it's where we kind of call out all the waste, fraud, and abuse from the past year in the state of Tennessee. So some of that's statewide spending, some of that's local spending, and we really go across the entire state where we do 3 examples from Middle Tennessee, 3 examples from East Tennessee, and 3 from West Tennessee, along with statewide examples. So it's really just our kind of, people aren't always paying attention during the year. It's us kind of reading through budgets, reading through the comptroller's reports, and watching, great things like News Channel 5 or 4 or 2 or Fox in Nashville, and kind of getting some of these great stories that came out and putting them all in one place for taxpayers to see it.
And what stood out to you? We're going to go through each one, as many as we can, on this report. But first, give us the overview. I mean, what kind of stood out to you in this year? What kind of dominated the report?
Well, I think it's interesting that you bring that up, because when I come on here, usually we say, okay, well, here's a couple examples. Not a lot of people agree with this one, or some people don't agree with this one. There's a lot more, pretty much everyone agrees this year. We say, okay, yeah, I might agree with that, but this money was spent terribly. And what we've seen is with the COVID funds that are national kind of funds, like put into Tennessee or put into localities, we've seen the government doesn't really view that as taxpayer money, which it is. Just because it funnels through Washington first doesn't make it not taxpayer money. So when you say, oh, this is a terrible contract with taxpayer money, it's like, oh no, don't worry about it. It's federal funds. That's still our tax dollars. So we've seen a lot with a lot of the COVID money coming in nationally, that a lot of localities and the state have not spent that money all that well.
And we'll go through. There was one, the governor's plan to pay tourists, right? Didn't he paid for plane tickets for tourists to come to Tennessee. And even people in his own party were not very happy with that, right?
Yeah, that's right. Tennessee on Me. And like I said, you want to talk about bipartisan consensus, is that Governor Lee's Tennessee on Me plan was an abject failure. And when you look at kind of what the role of government is supposed to do, you might have people on the left that think the government should be doing more than they are now. You might have people on the right saying they're not doing enough. I don't think anybody thinks they should be paying for tourists, plane tickets, and hotels. And that's exactly what they did. Of course, I do think that, Governor Lee's heart was in the right place. He said, we're getting out of the pandemic. We want to help businesses. But the fact is that this was just a terrible way of doing it. And we should never be paying for people who are probably coming here anyway to pay $250 for their hotel or their airfare. It just doesn't make any sense. And any reasonable person can say that is not the job of government, and we should not be doing that.
And so as we go through these, there will be times I'll try and play a little bit of devil's advocate, because
it's hard on this one though, right?
Well, I mean, here's how I'll play that. I would say, okay, it's a pandemic, and tourism was really, decimated, and we do have this money. Let's bring tourists here, make it easier for tourists to come here. That would be what I would say. What do you say back?
Sure. I mean, at that point that they did this program, tourism was already starting to pick up a lot. I mean, this was kind of after all the shutdowns, months after. So this whole idea, again, I get his heart was in the right place. I think that he was trying to help businesses, but it just was a poorly thought out plan. And when you see people could already be coming to Nashville, have trips planned and say, oh, you know what? I can get $250. So let me rebook this trip and get money. There's no evidence that it brought any new people into the state. And even, people, like you said, people from his own party are saying this doesn't make sense. And we've heard kind of, even he won't defend the program anymore. I haven't heard him say anything saying it was a success by any standard. So again, Bill Lee, I think generally has done a very good job as governor. This is one of the areas where he's kind of failed, in my opinion.
And so when you, as I try and play, mini devil's advocate as we go through some of these, what do you think is behind a lot of what you are reporting on this year? Is it that people go in a room and they're like, let's waste some money? Or is it people go in a room and they're like, we don't know what we're doing, or there's just basic corruption, or what is behind, when you boil all this down, what do you think's behind all of this?
Yeah, I mean, outside of the Metro Nashville Public Schools contract that may have been, let's just waste money. Most of these things are actually well-intentioned. They're ideas that people think is a good use of government spending. I think a lot of where we stand and say, you know what? You might think it's a good use, but that is not the government's job, in our opinion. Some of them were just poorly done contracts. I mean, I think that if you look at the Metro Nashville Public Schools contract on the COVID tracing, we're not against the idea that they signed a contract doing this. We're against the fact that there's an $18 million contract for a company that's never done anything before, and the terms of the deal were just horrible for taxpayers. So I think it's all across the board. Some of it's incompetence, some of it's places we just disagree, and then some of it's just an area where, okay, this might be fraud, or it's just a bad deal for taxpayers. So it's really all over the board, and we don't call politicians names, and we try not to question their motives. Some of these, it gets really hard though.
So that one you just mentioned, that was $18 million. I think that's your number. Is that your top one, your top most wasteful one? The Metro Schools.
One quarter of the year. So we put 3 of our finalists in there, which one of them was the Tennessee on Me. But the voters voted. People, hundreds of people voted from across the state, and the Metro Nashville Public Schools contract it won Pork of the Year. So it's kind of this horrible distinction, but it was the winner, I guess, in these terms. And
talk about that. So what happened with that? It did get some coverage, but what happened with that, and the concerns that you had again?
Yeah, and honestly, it got pretty minimal coverage to begin with. Dennis Ferrier from Fox 17 uncovered this, but this was, in all my years doing the Pork Report, it's been almost 10 years now. This might be the worst example I've ever seen. It was an $18 million contract. It was no bid to begin with. So anytime we're giving out $18 million in a no bid contract, that's already problem number one. Number two is what was produced. They decided to give this contract to Meharry Medical Ventures, which is a for-profit arm of Meharry that was just formed for this contract. And they spent $1.8 million on what could be described as the worst website ever created. And they spent $1.8 million on this when every expert said, you know what, maybe $50,000, maybe $75,000 with the government waste involved. So this was a terrible contract. But they also spent $600,000 each month just on maintenance of this contract. So it was a really, really bad deal. And now, because, it's got a lot more press, school board members can't defend it. They said, oh, well, you know what, our heart was in the right place, but maybe it wasn't a great deal. There is, again, this is such a bad contract. It is either the most incompetence I've ever seen, or it's straight up fraud. So I don't know which one it is, but this was a real, I think anybody who looks at this contract is going to say, wow, this taxpayers got really fleeced on this deal.
Was this for testing? Wasn't it for testing as well?
It was for testing as well, but that's not the part that we had issue with. It was really the website and the overall contract. And look, Memphis did a similar contract for 1/3 of the cost. And they have a very similar number. So, I mean, this is the biggest contract we've seen in the country for COVID testing. And you have to wonder, why are we paying this Meharry Medical Ventures to do a website? I mean, I could do a website on WordPress in 30 seconds. It looks better than what they created. And for them to charge taxpayers $1.8 million and $600,000 a month on maintenance for, again, this website with all the visual appeal of AskJeeves.com, you have to wonder, why are we doing this? And it's a terrible contract that nobody, even from MNPS or Meharry's, been able to defend.
When you put this list together, do you reach out to, I don't know, Meharry or the governor? Do you reach out and have them respond, or what about that part of it?
No, not really. I mean, ultimately, it doesn't really matter what their intentions were for this. We're just pointing out as waste. And I mean, on this one specifically, we did reach out to some web developers. We were like, okay, I'm not a website expert. I know this website's horrible, but maybe $1.8 million is the cost of doing this. Every expert I said, like, oh, 20, 30, 75,000 at the absolute max. And I know that we did our website, beacontn.org, and that looks about 100 times better and was 1/10,000th of the cost. So I think this was one of those ones we wanted to make sure we were right, because again, we're not saying the contract itself, forming a contract was wasteful. It's what we actually got out of it that was a problem.
So here you have two that really did. They both got a decent amount of attention, or have recently, and they both upset a lot of people. They both also had to do with COVID. And so when you look at all of this year's, the things that you're pointing out this year, is COVID a theme that goes through a lot of them?
Yeah, I mean, I think 3 out of the 12 of them have some kind of COVID relation. And I think it's one of those issues where, because, you know, it was such an emergency, people just rush. And the idea that we can do a no-bid contract, we had Governor Lee's masks on there last year, too, for a no-bid contract. So I do think there was more, because it was an emergency, there was a little bit more, oh, let's just go. We don't need to worry about our normal way of doing business. But that's the whole reason we have it that way. We have it set up that way for a reason. So when emergencies happen, we have a process to go through. So I think that people are using the pandemic as an excuse for some of their bad spending, to be honest.
Another thing that's on here is this mega site. You call it a handout for Ford to move to the West Tennessee mega site. One thing that's been a theme in many of these pork reports over the years has been the role of government in kind of luring business in. I guess incentives and that kind of thing, right? Let's talk about first this out in West Tennessee. What concerned you, and kind of what's the situation there?
Sure. And I said, I mean, a lot of these entries, pretty much it's unanimous agreement that it's pork. This is one where it's not, right? There is a lot of people who think it was a good deal, or that we should have done it because it's a huge investment. But our issue was, there was a lot of problems with this. First of all, the mega site in general was a waste of money. I mean, the idea that we did this, it sat empty for 16 years. So this whole idea that we're going to invest, $200 million in this empty field. And again, it took 16 years to even get a tenant for this. So we've had this in pork reports for, the last 12 years, this mega site in general. Some of it was this idea of a sunk cost, right? We've already spent this much money. We have to bring somebody in. I mean, again, everyone from Republicans to Democrats have talked about how bad of a deal the original mega site was to build that. So it's great we got somebody there. I mean, we welcome Ford with open arms, but you have to wonder, $1 billion of taxpayer money to an automaker. And if we've seen anything from other examples, whether it's VW or Nissan, these automakers come in here and then they want more and more money. It's not just a one-time gift, right? It's say, okay, we did this. Oh, we want to do this new line of cars. Can I get another $400 million? If not, we'll do that in Alabama. So it's this continuous cycle of us giving them money. And we're happy with some of the issues. I mean, we actually kind of worked on it to make sure that there was at least some more transparency in it and there were some clawbacks. But overall, I mean, we've been against this consistently for 15 years. And a lot of these deals have failed. Look at what Foxconn in Wisconsin, it's been a complete failure by any standard. And when you're giving out $1 billion of tax money, you really need to look at the deal. And we just did not think it was a good deal.
$1 billion? So it's that high. It's $1 billion.
It is $1 billion when you include what they gave them, the cost of the mega site, and then all the roads and the infrastructure they need to build to get over there. I think it ends up being about $1.1 billion total when you include all of it. In
here, I think you say it's more than the state will spend on mental health care. Is that right, or do I have that?
Yeah, it's double what the state spends on mental health care, and that includes the federal money coming in. So I mean, it's hard sometimes when you talk about big numbers, but $1 billion for a state budget is just an unbelievable amount of money to spend.
Now, okay, to attempt to play devil's advocate, it's going to bring in jobs. It's a whole new company. Once that factory is there, they're going to build all-electric F-150 trucks. So Ford's F-150 all-electric. I guess that would be a big deal. And then there would be other businesses that go all around it. And so we get this foothold, and it will pay for itself.
Well, the question is, first of all, was the $1 billion necessary to lure them here, right? When you actually look at it, when you talk to CEOs and they have an annual survey they do, incentives was 7th on their list. The thing they care about most is tax structure. They care about workforce, which there's not much of there. And ultimately, yes, that matters. But when you look at it, they might have come for $200 million. They might have come for nothing. I mean, Tennessee is a thriving place. They're getting a free, gigantic place to build a factory for free. Why do we need to give them $1 billion on top of that? I think it's one of these self-fulfilling prophecies that, they wouldn't come unless we do this. Well, that's not true. And if you actually ask CEOs, I think it's like 94% of CEOs said that they would have gone to that place even without the incentive. So I think we need to kind of redefine how we think of this. And what do you say to Volkswagen? What do you say to Nissan? You came in here, we didn't give you $1 billion. Why is that fair? What about other car industries that we give no money to? I mean, the whole point is that this is not the government's job. We're glad to have Ford. It's excellent that they're here, but why are we funding them coming here? They're a gigantic company. They can afford it themselves. And we already have a great tax structure. And if we're gonna do anything, let's work on making Tennessee the best place to start a business and stop giving handouts to individual businesses over other ones.
And the other thing that you do here, and you kind of addressed it, is, okay, if we don't give it to them, then they go somewhere else. Then Alabama will give it to them, or Kentucky, or Missouri, or somewhere. And to some extent, that seems true. It seems like someone else would give them money. It is a big deal. It looks really good for people to say this big job-creating business is coming here. And so how do we combat that? Do you think we're making progress in combating that, or are we going to continue to play this game?
Well, I mean, I don't know if we're making progress. I think that Tennessee is a place that everyone wants to come in. If you look at the numbers of people coming into the state, I mean, people are coming from all over the place, businesses that aren't getting tax breaks. And the best example I have is that when you looked at the Amazon, one of their HQ2 headquarters, which was in right outside of Washington, D.C., they picked going to Virginia despite being offered, I think, almost $1 billion more to go to Maryland, which is, 45 minutes away in the D.C. area. And because of Virginia had a much better tax structure, they had a better workforce, they picked that and left $1 billion, on the table and said, we want to go to a place where we get a workforce, we have a good tax structure. And that's what it comes down to. Nothing personal, but I don't know what companies would go to Mississippi or Alabama over Tennessee. I don't think that's a place that we have to argue. And guess what? If they want to give them $200 billion to come there, they're going to lose out. It doesn't matter how many jobs it creates, because they're still going to lose money on that. So I think we have to have this structure that just because we say jobs doesn't make it a good deal. Even if would it be a good deal to create 100 jobs for $10 million? I don't think so, right? I think we need to talk about not everyone's against this whole idea of corporate welfare like we are, but there's still this idea of it needs to be a good deal. Just because you create 5 jobs for, $100 billion, you still created jobs, but it's not a good deal for taxpayers. And
you think it's going to be up to elected officials to hold the line on this, right? Because if you're a CEO of a company, why wouldn't you sit there and say, I'm going to go to where I get the best offer, and if this neighboring state over here is going to give me X amount of dollars, if you don't match it, I'm going to go there. Because that's kind of the game that's being played, right?
Yeah, and we can't blame the company, right? Ford did what they're supposed to do. They did what their stockholders wanted to do. They did what their employees wanted to do. They got a bunch of money that they didn't have to put out for. So as a CEO, I would do that too. The issue, it comes down to government, right? And as people are more educated about these deals and seeing a lot of the failures that have happened, and when you look at Nashville, you see a ton of examples of, I can't believe the government gave, the local government gave a hotel in Broadway money to come there. I can't believe the government is subsidizing the Titans and the Predators. So I think when you look at some of these examples, you can say, wow, it's unbelievable the government is doing that. So it really comes down to government officials being held accountable. And every time this happens, you get the press release, you get the ribbon cutting, that's great. But it's up to us to dig into these numbers. And part of the issue becomes that the transparency isn't there either. Every number should be out there. And if we're going to give, a bunch of money to a company, they should be meeting the goals that they set out to, which a lot of times they have not in the past.
We are talking with Mark Cunningham. He's with the Beacon Center of Tennessee. And we are talking about the pork report that was put out by the Beacon Center, which lists some of the most wasteful spending, according to the Beacon Center, over the past year. That kind of sets the table for our discussion. Now we want to hear from you, Ronnie, others. Hold on the line, and there's the number if you want to call in, 615-737-PLUS, 615-737-7587. We'll take a break. Be back right after this.